Yeah.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. We will go ahead and get started here, although I'm sure there's going to be more people joining us. Thank you for joining us for our Brown Bag Lecture Series. The way this is going to work, I know last time we had a special event with a consulate. So for any of you that are new, we will have a presentation and then it'll be followed by a question and answer session. Our presentation and our presenter will be introduced first in Nahuatl by the wonderful Patrick Cheney, who is a graduate of the Summer Nahuatl program and is kind enough to read that for me so that I don't have to make your ears bleed since I don't speak Nahuatl yet. Hopefully one day. But anyway, I'll go ahead and turn the time over to Ricky to go ahead and introduce today's presentation and speaker. And then following his introduction in Nahuatl, I will go ahead and do that in English, and then we'll turn the time over to Megan.
Kena nimech tlaskamatelia pampa zampa initstoke towaya ipani tla sansekotelisli tlen tiktokastia brown bags. Tlawatil baktoke pampa tipia se totekishpo momastike ya itoka Megan Binkley wan ya tla panestis naman. Megan momashtia y doctorado ipan arqueología pan Wisconsin-Madison katlamastiloya. Ya momashtia waya itlamastika doctora Sarah Clayton wan Dr. J. Mark Kenoyer. Megan tlatetemoa ika arqueología mesoamericana ipa A de Ome wan tlajo ciento hasta A de Chiknawi ciento. Wei shiwikawi teipa totiotsi. Momashtia tlamanestil kanaya ethnoarchaeología wan métodos tlen archaeometría tlen ikamomati keniji mochiwayaya se tlamantli ipa wewe altepeme tlen kipoloje tlamantli ethnohistórico. Megan nohia tekiti pan Hoocąk altepe pan UW-Madison Nelson Institute wan pan la UW-Madison Biotechnology Cali kampa kiita otli tlen Hoocąk wan kichiwa métodos analíticos kampa kiita tlamantli ishkopinkayot tlen mopajpayaya ika cerámica. Nama ya kinestis kensin tlen itlatatemolis tlen ika tekiti sansejo waya la UW-Madison Nelson Institute wan Hoocąk altepe tlen kitekiwia ni eyi métodos kampa kiyekana masewal tlatoli itoka se kanaya wan tlapowalisli tlen tlamanestil kanaya. Ni tlapanestili kitekiwia se tlapowalisli tlen se tlamanestil kanaya tlen kichije ika ni métodos. Pani tlan panestil kanaya ya kitemoa Hoocąk itlapowalis ken se altepe tlen monawatia iselti wan tamatelisli tlen momati nama pan Wisconsin wan tlapowalisli tlen Hoocąk keniji yolke tlen Teejóp nawi akamoli zo wei Madison tlali. Ya technonotzas ika Castilla tlatoli. Nama towantin tichiwase senja dinámica ken nochipa. Achtowi ya sanilos wan teipa tipiase maklakli pilkawitsitzin tlan inkineki imowantin inki tlatlanalice se tlamantli. Wan nama sanilos kariachi ika ingles wei tlaskamati.
Thanks, Ricky. So thank you all again for joining us for the Brown Bag Lecture Series. We're very excited to have one of your fellow classmates, Megan Binkley, presenting for us today. Megan is an incoming graduate student in the Archaeology PhD program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison under the supervision of Dr. Sarah Clayton and Dr. J. Mark Kenoyer. Megan's research interests include Mesoamerican archaeology during the Classic period, archaeological cartography, ethnoarchaeology and developing archaeometric methods for accessing perishable craft industries in societies lacking ethnohistoric records. She is currently collaborating with the Hoocąk Nation, the UW-Madison Nelson Institute, and the UW-Madison Biotechnology Lab to map ancient Hoocąk travel routes and develop chemical analysis methods for detecting dye and colorant residues in archaeological ceramics. Today, she will share some of her research in collaboration with the UW-Madison Nelson Institute and the Hoocąk Nation to outline 3 methods for honoring Indigenous language, place names, and histories through cartography. This presentation uses a story map created in collaboration using these methods, and she'll explore both the Hoocąk Nation's history as a sovereign nation in what is now known as Wisconsin, and the Hoocąk oral history surrounding the creation of Teejóp, the 4 Lakes or Greater Madison, Wisconsin area. So we will go ahead and first have Megan's presentation. Feel free to put any of your questions as she goes along in the chat, and we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for you all to ask any questions of her. Megan, take it away.
Plaskamati, Carrie and Ricky, thank you very much for the wonderful introductions. And thank all of you for being here. My name is Megan, and as Carrie and Ricky mentioned, I'm an incoming graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. This past semester, so in the spring, I had the privilege of working with Dr. Jesse Kenoyer and several community partners in the Madison, Wisconsin area and the University of Wisconsin-Madison University Year Alliance project to create a map that honors Hoocąk language, history, and culture in Teejóp. So for reference, Teejóp is the Hoocąk name for the 4 Lakes or Greater Madison, Wisconsin region. I'm excited to share some of the details of this project with you in mapping Hoocąk in Teejóp, honoring Indigenous place names through cartography. I hope that this presentation might provide insight into some of the work that's being done to uplift Indigenous voices in the Midwest and complement the other types of cultural education that we're receiving in our summer course currently. There will be some time at the end of the presentation for questions, or if you'd like to connect and talk about this research or other possibilities in the future. So as I briefly touched on, this project was made possible by thanks to numerous community partners. In particular, I would really like to thank Mr. William Quackenbush, the Hoocąk Nation Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and Division Manager, for the time and energy and wisdom that he's invested in this project. I'd also like to thank the Hoocąk Nation Language Division and the Hoocąk Nation Department of Natural Resources, as well as the village of Waunakee, which is a suburb of Madison, Wisconsin. The community members of Waunakee and the school administrators contributed feedback on drafts and lists of geographic features to include in the map. Finally, I would like to acknowledge the University of Wisconsin-Madison Department of Geography for their feedback and assistance throughout the project, and the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies and the University Year Alliance for bringing all of this together and making this possible. All right, so before I walk through the goals of the project with you, I would like to say I have included a picture of the full map as it is now on this slide. It's a somewhat complex and visually full map, so I have included close-ups of specific relevant map features throughout the presentation. And then at the very end, I'll provide another look at the full project to help us visualize how all of the different components come together. I would like to note that this map is in the final stages of review with our Hoocąk Nation community partners and isn't yet available to the public. Once the final version has been fully reviewed and approved, it will be available through Hoocąk Nation media and community education platforms. The ultimate goal of this project was to create a story map that highlights Hoocąk language, culture, and history in Teejóp, and specifically in the area of what is now known as the village of Waunakee. As I mentioned, the village of Waunakee is a suburb of Madison, Wisconsin, and it's of particular importance because of its proximity to several ancestral Hoocąk Nation settlement sites. Waunakee is also situated at the critical point in the Yahara watershed, the meeting place of the Yahara River and the Teejóp Lakes chain. For reference, the Yahara watershed is a 359 square mile land area in south central Wisconsin that drains into the Yahara River. This watershed covers over a quarter of the land in the county and allows rainfall and snowmelt to run from the Yahara River into the Teejóp Lakes, which are sometimes known as Lake Mendota, Lake Monona, Lake Wabisa, Lake Wingra, and Lake Kigansa. From here, these waters continue into the Rock River, the Mississippi River, and eventually the Gulf of Mexico. The Yahara watershed and the greater Teejóp area have been the homeland of the Hoocąk Nation since time immemorial and are irreplaceable components of the Hoocąk culture, food systems, heritage, and ideologies. So with all of this in mind, my community partners and I decided to create this map by combining a traditional cartographic workflow with 3 specific techniques for honoring the Hoocąk Nation. In these next few slides, I'll walk you through the cartographic workflow that we used and the techniques we developed for highlighting Hoocąk culture and history. So we began by developing a proposal, of course, and confirming the project goals with our community partners, including Mr. Quackenbush and Dr. Conaway. Specifically, we discussed the map scale, the goals, the intended visual emphases, and the intended audiences. The preliminary planning stage also included brainstorming a color palette using the hex color codes of prominent color nation tribal website as a starting point. My community partners and I ended up settling on a map for public use that emphasized the adjacency and proximity of Hoocąk Nation archaeological sites and modern Hoocąk Nation properties with other modern geographic features in the Madison area. This approach was designed to emphasize the fact that the Hoocąk Nation has always existed in this land and continues to thrive here today. The community-based cartographic process that we implemented for this map was probably the most important step of this entire project and centered the voices of community partners, both from within the Hoocąk Nation and from the Village of Waunakee leadership team. So based on these design choices, we ultimately chose to include a base map of the Village of Waunakee and the surrounding towns of Westport, the towns of Dane, Vienna, and Springfield, all of which are suburbs of the greater Teejóp or Madison area. On top of this, we chose to include waterways such as lakes, rivers, streams, and watersheds, select roads for visual context and orientation, modern Hoocąk Nation fee and trust lands, the 1825 Hoocąk temporary treaty map, the Hoocąk pre-colonial ancestral territories as they are recorded in oral histories, and the written markers indicating the general area of some Hoocąk Nation archaeological sites, Hoocąk language, place, and feature names for as many of these elements as possible. Archaeological sites were marked as general areas as opposed to specific locations to help protect the sites and support cultural heritage preservation. At the behest of our community partners in Waunakee, I also specifically included popular local features such as the Governor Nelson State Park, which you'll see in just a sec, the county's North Mendota Bike Trail, and Schnitz Woods near the border of Waunakee and Vienna. Going back here so you can get another glimpse of how this comes together. This is obviously a good amount of information to include in a single map. So as I was visualizing layout and design, I decided to split the aforementioned elements between the main map and the inset map, which we'll get to see up close in just a minute. I also decided to make use of the negative space around the edges of the map to include written versions of oral histories. My community partners and I decided to mark geographic elements in the main map associated with the Hoocąk Nation in a dark shade of red found on the tribe's website in an effort to make these elements more visually prominent while allowing the muted greens and blues of the background to recede slightly. And from here, I began to collect data and map components in the form of shapefiles, PDF reference maps, and oral histories. For reference, shapefiles are files that show visual representations of geographic features. These shapefiles are often layered on top of each other and labeled to create maps. The shapefiles used in this map come from a couple of different sources, most of which are publicly and freely available. The only limited access map layers used for the shapefiles that are included in this inset map, which I'll talk about in more detail in just a sec. These files show Hoocąk Nation fee and trust lands, Hoocąk legislative districts, and ancestral oral history lands. These files come directly from the Hoocąk Nation Department of Natural Resources. The shape files of the state of Wisconsin and the other shape files used to create the main map came from online data banks, such as the Dane County GIS Data Catalog, Geodata at Wisconsin, and the DNR GIS Data Catalog. And then the oral histories that were used in this project were provided by Mr. Bill Quackenbush, either through conversation or as transcribed PDF or Word documents. They appear on the map as the Earthmaker or Mauna story, and in the inset map as well. Mr. Quackenbush, team members from the Hoocąk Nation GIS Department, and Mr. Tom Wilson of Waunakee also kindly provided us with reference maps and historical maps showing Hoocąk Nation archaeological sites, migration routes, and important cultural sites. So all of these shapefiles were combined in ArcGIS Pro and then combined in a software called ArcGIS Pro, and then projected using the USA Contiguous Albers Equal Area Conic Projection and colored using a color palette that was established with our community partners. The map draft was then exported to Adobe Illustrator, and the 3 specific techniques we developed for honoring Hoocąk Nation culture and history were incorporated. So the first of these 3 techniques was the inclusion of an inset map dedicated to information about the history of the Hoocąk Nation and the nation's modern governmental structure. This was designed to assert tribal sovereignty. Now, the modern Hoocąk Nation government is based in Black River Falls, Wisconsin. So on the slide, I've included a close-up picture of the inset map. We implemented this technique by including a geographic features that you see in the lower right-hand corner, by including a brief written summary of the main historical points we wanted to convey. This written summary includes an acknowledgement of the fact that the Hoocąk Nation has lived in this area since time immemorial, spanning at least 3 ice ages, and a list of the 12 Hoocąk Nation tribes. The summary also includes an acknowledgement of the U.S. federal campaigns of displacement, persecution, and violence directed toward the Hoocąk Nation. These campaigns were designed to impose colonial cultural norms and land use approaches on the First Nations and to destroy the Hoocąk Nation's ancestral migration routes and relationship with their homeland. Finally, this summary describes how the Hoocąk Nation survived this persecution and continues to govern some areas of their ancestral homeland through a general tribal council and executive, legislative, and judicial government branches. Throughout this summary, we made a conscious effort to include Hoocąk language words. This choice allowed us to honor the Hoocąk names for their own institutions and culture, to introduce audience members from outside the Hoocąk Nation to elements of Hoocąk language, and to demonstrate how the inclusion of Indigenous languages can and should be normalized in cartographic processes. So the second technique, the second cultural recognition technique we employed was the use of Indigenous place and feature names wherever possible. For clarification, these Hoocąk language names were used in addition to the Hoocąk language words interspersed throughout the text paragraphs on the map. We worked closely with the Hoocąk Nation Language Division and with Mr. Bill Quackenbush to identify and translate place names for the map and to find and use the correct Hoocąk language characters. For anyone who might be interested in using the Hoocąk language in their own projects, the font with the correct characters is available for download by request through the Hoocąk Nation Language Division website. We learned that it's valuable to translate Hoocąk place and feature names using the following format: Hoocąk language name followed by the English translation followed by the English name, or just the Hoocąk language name followed by the English translation. This order ensures that the Hoocąk language name is in the forefront of each feature and receiving context. I've provided 3 close-up examples from our map on this slide. On the left, you can see there's a close-up image of what's called the Old Village or Stotts archaeological site using the darker red-brown font color decided upon by my community partners. On the top right, you can see the Hoocąk language name for freshwater spring. Springs are important in Hoocąk culture, and I've been told that they're often associated with medicine or important gatherings. The icon for the spring came from the website The Noun Project. On the bottom right, you can see an example of Hoocąk language names used in the context of water features in this specific labeled the Niyahara, or Catfish Waters, and provided the English Yahara River name below. So the third cultural recognition technique that we employed was the inclusion of a full oral history account of the creation of Teejóp, the Four Lakes area. As I mentioned, this account is broadly known as Mauna, or the Earthmaker creates Teejóp. In this account, the giant hero god Mauna journeys down to Teejóp from the north and sets his earthen kettle to boil at the edge of a series of hollows. The hero god is distracted by a noise in the woods, which he believes may be his friend Bear. While he's up looking for Bear, the kettle boils over and fills the chain of hollows, creating the Teejóp Lakes. The account ends with Earthmaker sitting to eat what remains of his dinner and naming the new lakes he sees before him. This specific version of the story included in this map is a replica of the version written down in 1942 by the archaeologist Charles Brown. The account was told to Charles by Hoocąk Nation tribal member John White. The PDF of the 1942 account was provided to us by Mr. Bill Quackenbush, and the inclusion of the account provides important historical and cultural context to the map. So in this slide, I've included another image of the full map project so we can come a full circle and visualize how the three cultural recognition techniques that we discussed fit into a greater whole. As you can see, the main map containing Indigenous place and feature names occupies the majority of the page. The inset map, dedicated to providing historical context and asserting tribal sovereignty, underlines the main map and complements the map title to frame the central content. The remaining negative space on the map, particularly on the right-hand side, was used to incorporate the Earthmaker creates Teejóp oral history. The map is definitely visually full, but as our community partner, Mr. Quackenbush, says, sometimes story maps are best enjoyed slowly over a cup of coffee. This project generated several important takeaways that can be applied to other cartographic projects uplifting Indigenous voices and aiding cultural heritage preservation efforts. First, this map demonstrates that oral histories and accounts are a vital component of watershed and environmental data. Oral histories are just as valuable to our understanding of the land around us as quantitative data. Second, the story maps have particular potential to acknowledge the ways in which stories, oral histories, and language are part of land and water data. In some ways, story maps are ideal platforms for blending complementary qualitative and quantitative data into a final cohesive product. And finally, cartographic labels, particularly the labels of natural places and geographic features, are fantastic opportunities for centering First Nation voices and culture in mapping projects. Again, thank you all for being here, and thank you to my community partners for making this possible. If you are interested in seeing the map when it's available to the public or accessing a copy of it, please feel free to reach out at any of the email addresses listed on this page. Yeah, and now we have time for questions or comments.
Hey, thank you so much for sharing that, Megan. That's really, really interesting research that you started on there. So we now have time for you all to ask any questions that you have of Megan. If you would put those in the chat, that would be great. Or if it's a more complicated question, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, I can call on you and we can go ahead and proceed in that way. Okay, so we do have a question from Hoocąk. How do you make a plan for incorporating others like archaeological data set? Example, the Mississippian culture.
So my best advice on that would be to start by having a conversation with a representative of the culture that you're hoping to map, and really clearly establish what they are comfortable having portrayed on a map, because one of the reasons, as I mentioned, that we stayed away from marking specific archaeological sites was because we were trying to protect them. And even people who are, well-intentioned but curious can still interact with those landscapes in a way that's not appropriate or even potentially damaging. So I think having those conversations, making those community connections it's a vital first step. And then from there, a lot of First Nations and tribes have shapefiles and GIS layers that contain the geographic information about where these mounds are. And that can be included in publicly available layers to create a map. Does that answer your question? Does that kind of give you a good starting point?
I think so. Humphrey, do you have anything else to ask or add to that? No? Okay. Great. And I was wondering, Megan, since you're talking about this, what I'm really curious about is obviously this was a pretty involved process, and it's obviously very important that the Hoocąk Nation themselves was involved in this. What was the timeline like for this? How long had conversations been in place or relationships started to be established before starting this project?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And my mentor, Dr. Kenoyer, I came into this project in a very privileged position because I was able to make use of the connections that Dr. Kenoyer has been building for the better part of 15 years at this point. And so Dr. Kenoyer is the professor who supervised kind of my interactions with the Hoocąk Nation. And she did her PhD at UW-Madison and has been working with Mr. Quackenbush. Yeah, I think it's about 14 or 15 years now. And so the timeline for the actual project, using these longstanding relationships and the conversations that those enabled, it was supposed to take a semester, and then it ended up extending beyond that. It turned into a 5 or 6 month project. And actually, after this language program concludes, we will be returning to it and developing the project in a new direction. Specifically, we're going to be creating some new, these shapefiles mapping layers, showing ancestral Hoocąk travel routes and migration routes that don't currently exist on any maps. So it's a never-ending project, but the map itself took probably 5 months.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for explaining that. 15 years and still going. That's great.
Yes, yeah.
What other questions do we have? I can keep asking, but I want to give you all the opportunity. You can put those in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself if you have a question for Megan.
Yeah, I put a question in the chat. Okay, you can't see it?
No, I don't see it. Do you want to just go ahead and ask, and maybe if you put, I'm not seeing any other questions in there. So if anybody else is in that position that you put one in, we'll have you go after John. Just let me know.
Okay, Megan, what is the current state of the language in the communities? And the second question is, has anybody expressed interest in making a monolingual version of the map?
So the language is critically endangered. At this point, I believe there are fewer than 200 or 250 native speakers who are still alive. That being said, efforts are being taken to revitalize the language. The Hoocąk Nation, from what Mr. Quackenbush has told me, has diverted significant resources to create what's called language apprenticeship programs, which are specifically geared toward young Hoocąk Nation members and members of the community from beyond the nation who are interested in learning the language. Now, as we know, being a native speaker versus learning a language when you're older, there's a different level of intimacy with the language, but it is a way of keeping the language alive and maintaining that cultural aspect and the connection. No one has brought up the idea of doing a monolingual version of the map yet. I think specifically because the impetus behind the map creation was to do cross-cultural education. So to make, words from the Hoocąk language, perspectives on the landscape that arise from Hoocąk culture available to people in the Teejóp area from outside of the Hoocąk nation, which means usually English speakers. But that being said, once the map is completed, that it's entirely Mr. Quackenbush's property. So I wouldn't be surprised if at some point we do see a version that's entirely done in Hoocąk language.
Thanks.
Okay, has anybody else, oh, here we go. Abe, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, of course. And so, Megan, thank you for the presentation. Cloud quality. I would like to ask you just two questions. Can you say how did you start your first interest in archaeology? And what inspired you to study archaeology? And I took some classes about archaeology, and as a Nawa person, we do not have like many students of archaeology, right? But how was in your case? Thank you so much.
Yeah, Tlaskamati. I think, my interest in archaeology started when I was much, much younger, probably 12 or 13, but it kind of matured into more of a, or lesser romanticized interest and more of an actual serious career interest, probably in the last 5 or 6 years. I've always been interested in Teotihuacan and really interested in learning about the classic period cities and nations of central Mexico. That being said, I think at this point I'm learning a lot more about the colonial history of archaeology and kind of that heavy and often exploitative history of the discipline. And so I'm hoping to spend the next several years in my graduate degree really exploring ways of making an archaeological practice that's collaborative and built in kind of the joint production of knowledge with Indigenous communities.
Thanks, Abe, for your question. Any other questions? Well, while you all are thinking, I did have a couple more for you as well. So obviously you're in the summer NAWAT program, and I would just be kind of interested to know how has this project and your work with the Hoocąk Nation kind of impacted your study of NAWAT? Like, are there certain perspectives or connections that you're seeing as you're starting to learn NAWAT and more about the culture as well?
Yeah, I think that the doing this project with the Hoocąk Nation has really driven home the importance of learning a language and learning Indigenous languages for me, and kind of helped me understand that you can't fully understand a place if you don't know some of the Indigenous languages, and you can't really fully understand a culture if you don't speak the language. That being said, it's much harder to do for a society that existed several thousand years ago, and we're not sure what language was spoken there. But there's a general sense that Nahuatl is probably what was spoken, a version of Nahuatl is probably what was spoken at Teotihuacan. Yeah, I think the mapping project really is what pushed me to take that final step and actually invest in learning an Indigenous language, hopefully several over the next several years.
Wonderful. And just to kind of follow up on that, sorry. I'm also thinking, as you talk about this, there's such an importance, and you did it even down to like the granular detail of choosing specific colors so that it was really a story that's being told by the Hoocąk Nation and not necessarily by outsiders. How did you end up selecting the stories, the oral histories that were put onto the map? And I'm also curious to know how much of these stories and the other data that you used was readily available, and how much of that maybe you had to go out and work directly with the people to collect at this time.
Yeah, those are fantastic questions. The oral history that we used, I came into this really hoping that I might get to hear some oral histories, but I did not expect to be able to actually get a written version of one or share it. But Mr. Quackenbush actually requested that we include it. There is some tension, within the Madison archaeological community and the Indigenous community, and I'm sure in other places as well, over accounts of how and when the first human inhabitants of the area appeared. The Hoocąk Nation, their oral histories clearly state that they have existed there since time in 3 ice ages. And then, the non-Indigenous archaeological community says, no, you came here at this time, at this year. And then there's a lot of tension there. And I think the archaeological narrative is often privileged in terms of what's shared in community education efforts. So when Mr. Quackenbush was like, yeah, no, I'd really like to get this account, the Hoocąk account of how Teejóp was created, and how and when it was populated out, and share it with the public. That was when we decided to incorporate that oral history into the map.
Great, thank you. All right, everyone. Are there any final questions or comments for Megan before we close?
Hi, Megan. Thank you for the talk. It's so fascinating. Just a comment. I'm going to put it in the chat. It reminds me of a map making project by an artist of the Sami indigenous culture from North Europe, and it shows like the Sami communities at the location of them, but also within like their view of the world. It's really fascinating. It kind of reminds me of this. I was just curious too about what the visual culture of the Hoocąk Nation was like, and if they had any like placemaking imagery within that visual culture.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I don't know almost anything about Hoocąk Nation imagery or the visual culture aside from there are discussions that some of our community partners shared with me about the way that settlements and villages were created and are represented in specific works of art. They were mobile. These villages, they moved, they followed specific resources, they followed specific cultural practices. And so they were not necessarily sedentary in the way that we might think of a sedentary settlement or village or town today. But yeah, that's a fantastic question. I don't know enough to answer it beyond that, but thank you for sharing the link.
Oh, thank you.
Great, thank you for that connection. And there's links in the chat for that. Any final questions or comments? All right, well, thank you so much, Megan, for sharing your research with us. And really what we want to do in these brown bags is be able to allow connections and information sharing on a variety of different Indigenous cultures and languages. So thank you for bringing that to us. We will see you all next week for our next brown bag. We will have that information out to you shortly. It'll still be from 1:40 to 2:30. So plan on that. And then have a great day with your classes before they get started up in just a little bit. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for hosting me.